Ambassador David Comissiong, Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, is here with us this morning to discuss a little more. Good morning to you, Ambassador.
Morning, Tisha. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. 48 years since that day. There have been so many accounts of what happened from a Barbadian's perspectives. It is pretty gruesome, all that happened way back then. Are there still people who are coming forward and sharing what they experienced on that day?
Well, I would say that many of the people who were directly involved 48 years ago have passed on. This thing had a devastating effect, especially on the Cuban families. So it wasn't just the loss of the family member in the tragedy itself, but some family members in Cuba lost the will to live, So 48 years later, a lot of people are still living, even though they may not have been even around in 1976, but still living with the pain that it caused the family. And of course, the Cuban nation. That Cubana tragedy has seared itself into the collective consciousness of the Cuban nation. And, it was when Dame Billy Miller went to Cuba and she saw this photograph of this massive public meeting in Cuba's Revolutionary Square, over 1 million people, and she asked, well, what is that? What occasion was that? And then they explained to her that was the meeting that was held a few days after the Cubana disaster, when Fidel Castro addressed the nation. Over 1 million people turned up, and it was then that she recognized what a significant event this was for the Cuban people, and that is where she got the idea that Barbados had to establish that monument that we have at Paynes Bay. So, but to answer your question, work is still being done. Documentary films are still being created. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of the direct participants have passed.
Now, on Sunday, we gathered at the monument. There was also recognition in Cuba of the day itself. Talk us through exactly how that ceremony went.
Yeah, well, every year since the event in 1976, Barbadians, we have been holding commemorative events in Paynes Bay. At first, it used to be the civil society Cuban solidarity organizations, but then when government established the monument in 1998, Fidel came and we officially launched the monument, government stepped into the picture. So every year now, it is the Cuban Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Barbados that put together the ceremony. So this year, we had Minister Sandra Husbands as acting Minister of Foreign Affairs. We had, of course, the Cuban Ambassador Yanet Stabu. We had the Guyana's Consul General, Ms. Geneva Ross Tyndall. I spoke on behalf of the government of Barbados, and we had Ambassador Wayne McCook of CARICOM. Why did we have CARICOM? Well, 2 years ago, in December 2022, at the CARICOM Cuba summit here in Barbados, Barbados put forward a resolution that the 6th of October should be designated CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism. That was agreed by the governments of CARICOM and Cuba. And so what we were celebrating on Sunday was the second CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, hence the presence of Ambassador Wayne McCook, who is an Assistant Secretary General of CARICOM. So typically, every year we have commemorations in Barbados, of course, Cuba, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. So on Sunday, all 4 of those countries would have been commemorating, but it is my hope that now that it is CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, that all 15 CARICOM full member states will do commemorations as well.
On the day itself, on Sunday, I know that you gave an address. Would you like to set it up for us and mention briefly, what your message was going into this second CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism?
Yeah, sure. I will certainly do so. Just to preface what I will say, though, I want to make the point that what happened on the 6th of October 1976 has a real CARICOM background to it. It would not have, because, okay, let's start with 1972, when the leaders of Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Jamaica, the four then independent countries, decide, first of all, to establish CARICOM. But at the same time they made that decision, they made a decision that we are going to recognize Cuba, revolutionary Cuba. And that was a very courageous decision, because at that time, Cuba had been virtually totally isolated by the United States and the Organization of American States. So on the 8th of December 1972, the four countries defied the US, defied the OAS, recognized Cuba, and started relations with Cuba. The first significant thing that happened after that, October 1975, Fidel Castro asks Prime Minister Errol Barrow, would Barbados be a transshipment location for Cuban planes going to Angola? This was at the time of the liberation of Southern Africa. Angola was newly independent, but it was being attacked by racist white South African troops and counter-revolutionary rebels, and it was in danger of falling. And so Barbados agreed, and Cuban planes bringing the soldiers landed in Barbados to make that journey across the Atlantic to Angola. That went on for 3 months, October to December 1975, and those Cuban troops got there just in time to save Angola. And then, of course, 1976. Right through the year 1976, a whole range of terrorist actions against Cuba. So we know about the Cubana in October, but in July, a bomb was actually planted in Sunjet House. BWIA was the agents for Cubana, so a bomb actually exploded in Sunjet House. Finally, they were able to achieve, these terrorists, what they wanted with the downing of the plane. So on Sunday, I recounted some of that history. I recounted the role that Barbados played in at least ensuring that the two functionaries who planted the bomb were arrested. They were tried in Venezuela. But I went on, really, the strongest point I really made was that now that we have declared this CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, that we use that day to denounce all forms of terrorism. Of course, I referenced Gaza, what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And then I went on to say that, even as we have our concern for terrorism in far-flung corners of the world, we have to come home as well to what has been done to Cuba. Because Cuba, ever since the triumph of their revolution in 1959, they have been the target of over 700 incidents of physical terrorism, and that has caused them great damage. But in addition to that, there's what I call the economic terrorism of being subjected to the US financial, economic, and trade blockade, and also being placed on this list, this undeserved placement on a list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism that has done great damage to the Cuban economy and, by extension, to the lives of the Cuban people. So once again, we called United States, President Biden, please, do the right thing. Remove that blockade. Remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors.
And of course, that plea was made by Prime Minister Motley at the UN General Assembly last week as well.
This event is such an important event. I mean, this is really the poster child of terrorism. This was the first time, everybody knows about the infamous 9/11, when civilian airliners full of passengers were flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. But 25 years before that, the world's first 9/11 took place right here in Barbados. And I have here with me a copy of the report of the Commission of Inquiry that Barbados engaged in. You know, a lot of people don't recall that Barbados held a Commission of Inquiry into this event. In fact, just 1 week after the tragedy, the then acting Governor General, Sir William Douglas, established a Commission of Inquiry headed by Judge Denise Williams and with 2 other commissioners. And for approximately 1 month, public sessions were held at the #1 Supreme Court in Bridgetown. And so it was a very, they carried out a very serious inquiry. They were able to determine exactly what had happened. They were able to determine that perhaps the greatest cause of the tragedy was not even so much the explosion, but the fact that the explosions, it was 2 of them, created a fire in the plane. And as the fire burnt the material inside the cabin, it produced toxic gases that overwhelmed both the passengers and the flight crew. And in fact, one of the recommendations they made coming out of this inquiry was to the international civil aviation authorities that going forward, they needed to do research to create materials for the interior of commercial airlines that, if they caught fire, would not produce toxic gases. So, Barbados probably made a very big contribution to international aviation. But what I want to say, if I had to summarize how Barbados dealt with it, the Commission of Inquiry, the fact that Barbados sent Senior Superintendent Orville Durant, who later went on to become Commissioner of Police. He went to Trinidad, he went to Venezuela to do investigation into the two men who placed the bombs on the plane. These were 2 Venezuelans, Freddy Lugo and Ricardo Lozano, but they were really acting for 2 Cuban arch terrorists, Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Corriles, and who were veteran terrorists with some links to the Central Intelligence Agency as well. It must be said. But the Cubans were so impressed by how Barbados had conducted itself, the kind of investigation that Barbados had carried out, that when I produced this book a couple of years ago, I was very proud to include this passage, and I just read it, Tisha, because it gives me great pride, really. And I quote, "Almost 30 years after the tragic events of 6 October 1976, Mr. Ricardo Alarcon, the president of Cuba's National Assembly of People's Power, paid the ultimate compliment to the governments and people of Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago when he publicly stated that," and I quote him, "Barbados and Trinidad, it must be said, acted with great dignity and honor. He acknowledged the, quote, meticulous, rigorous, serious investigation done by people who respect themselves, people from countries that are small, but which know how to respect their sovereignty," end of quote. I thought that was a tremendous tribute, coming from the head of Cuba's National Assembly to the people and government of Barbados as to how, faced with this terrible tragedy, how we conducted ourselves, investigating it, and really doing all of the right things.
At the time on the ground, because I think I had a few stories from my mother, who at the time, would have been visiting the Black Rock area, and she said that, she remembers the tragedy as in, there were literally body parts and there was much debris and so on washing ashore. So do we have a sense of what was happening on the ground here in Barbados, even while the government and the people in power of the day were working toward finding out exactly what happened?
Well, CBC's Sherwood McCaskey has done a beautiful documentary, and Sherwood has unearthed a lot of footage from back in 1976. So you have these graphic images of Barbadians in small boats, and the Barbados Coast Guard, going into the area where the plane entered the sea, just off the Paynes Bay area, and actually taking out the limbs, arms and legs and fingers, and putting them in body bags. So this is why I say that this was our 9/11, because the Barbadian people had to go through that very traumatic experience. In fact, in Sherwood's film, Tisha, he tells the story of a nurse who was supposed to be on that flight. But when she was about to leave home to go to the airport, she received a call she was a QEH nurse, she received a call from the QEH telling her that she had to come to the QEH immediately to bring in some documents, which she couldn't understand it, but they insisted that she must come. And because she went to the QEH, she missed the flight. And while she was at the QEH, a call comes through from the airport asking, did your employee, nurse so-and-so, go on the flight? And they said, well, no, she's still here. And then they gave the news that the flight went down, and everybody was lost. And that nurse left the QEH immediately, went to the area of Paynes Bay, went out on one of those boats, and collected dismembered bodies. And Sherwood's documentary ends with her several years later in 2008 going to the monument for the first time, and just breaking down in tears as she looked at the names and said, my name could so easily have been on that. So there are those stories, very poignant, very touching stories. There's another filmmaker, Enrique Berumen, a Latino-American filmmaker. He too has made a very, very moving documentary. He showed it in Barbados about 2 years ago, and I'm hoping that at some point we could perhaps get it on CBC TV. But yes, work is still, in fact, just last night, the Venezuelan Charge d'Affaires told me about a Venezuelan filmmaker who will be coming to Barbados in November to do some additional filming to see how the incident impacted on Barbados itself. So there is still quite a bit of interest, and filmmakers and documentary makers are still exploring this event. And as I said, it's so important because it is really, if you really wanted, this is why we said 6th of October should be the day to focus on terrorism. And it's now the CARICOM Day, but I'm hoping that in the near future it will be a United Nations International Day against terrorism.
Yeah, I feel we really need to focus on continuing to share this story as well, because there are so many younger Barbadians who obviously are far removed from that intergenerational conversation where they would have people who can share about it. And there are so many people on highway, one every day driving past and not necessarily knowing what the monument is there for and what it commemorates. So, happy that we could produce the Cubana Flight 455, Barbados' Response, which is the name of the documentary produced by R. Sherwood McCaskey. And of course, you're going to get an opportunity to see it on TV8, again, even though it has been aired, but definitely shares...
he updated it.
Yes, definitely shares some very interesting parts of what happened in terms of Barbados' response. Like you mentioned, where can people get your book, Ambassador?
Well, I brought a copy for you.
Thank you. I love gifts, and I love to read.
But
so thank you.
At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, anybody contacting me at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Actually, I also have it in electronic format, so I could send it to anyone electronically as well. But you could get a physical copy if you contact me at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
All right. An essay, a short story, and a poem that recount the story of the act of terrorism that destroyed a Cubana airline full of passengers in the territory of Barbados on the 6th of October 1976. And many of these people were athletes. They were heading back home from a tournament they had attended in neighboring Trinidad. So definitely just people trying to make their way home. So I want to thank you for sharing with us in this way and continuing to share by heading out and really spearheading a lot of these relationships and conversations and moving us to a place where we acknowledge what has happened in Caribbean history, but most importantly, that we take action in going forward.
Yeah, and I take your point. It's really to focus on the current generation, the young people, because that's of our age. And anybody who was
our age, Ambassador.
Anybody who was at least a anybody who was at least a teenager in 1976, or even a primary school child, would remember the incident.
Yeah, because I wasn't around in 1976, not even thought of in 1976. My mother was around.
I'm glad
she remembers.
I'm glad you read the history books.
Yes, but she shared with me as well, because she recalls the horror, the terror of seeing limbs and just debris littered all across the beach and at the sea in the area of Paynes Bay and Black Rock and, in those general areas. Yeah. So, it's still fresh in her mind and in what she shared.
Man's inhumanity to man. And this is why we need to remember the day. We need to remember all of that suffering. We need to commemorate it, because we need to do so with the resolve that we are going to end terrorism once and for all.
All right. Thank you so much. As always, Ambassador, we'll see you next time for another conversation on CARICOM.
My pleasure.
Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.